Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. My guests today are Gloria Feldt, Deborah Siegel, and Courtney Martin, women from different generations, but all feminists, authors, and three-fourths of women, girls, ladies, a traveling panel that discusses issues reflecting our lives. So, who's the oldest generation? Gloria.
That would be me.
And Deborah's the second generation.
She's the bridge, as we say.
She's the bridge, and you are the baby.
Yes.
And we're missing somebody that's between Gloria and Deborah.
Yes.
Crystal Brunswick.
Right. Now, who decided to do this panel?
These two. It came out of a conversation in a coffee shop. My book had just recently come out, Sisterhood Interrupted, From Radical Women to Girls Gone Wild, and Courtney and I were brainstorming. And I think it was you who suggested this idea of having an intergenerational conversation among feminists on stage.
That's
and
so
then
great.
we started thinking, who else? And
Right. And you've all written books. You're all writers.
Yes.
And you don't have a book coming out, but you have
Not
a
at the
new
moment.
website.
I have a company, SheWrites.com.
A company. It's women writers from all over the world, right? And you've got a second book coming out, third
Actually,
book.
it'll be the
third
fourth book.
Fourth
The fourth book.
And it's about women in power?
It is called No Excuses, and it's about women's relationship with power and why this is the moment
Right.
to embrace it and use it well.
Right. And Courtney, you have
I have a book called Do It Anyway that's coming out in September, and it's profiles of 8 activists 35 years and younger, kind of trying to grapple with what is this new generation's relationship to activism.
That's a terrific subject, and you're an experienced activist with your charitable work of building networks. But you know, we don't have much time, so I don't want to get into it. What does feminism or being a feminist mean to each one of you? Is there a difference in the generation explanation?
That's a good question. To me, feminism means today what I think it always has, which is social, political, and economic equality for all women. I think that feminism has gotten a really bad rap. It's been framed by the media in lots of ways, and that the disagreements among generations often have to do more with an image or an idea of feminism rather than feminism itself.
It's very,
Yeah.
you?
I would really concur with what Deborah said. I always just say feminism is social justice.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is, and it's an ideal. And that's why you see feminists, and actually one of the problems that feminism has had is that instead of continuing to move forward for itself, we often step back in order to actually help other groups attain equality and justice. And that's been a pattern in the American feminist movement over the last 250 years.
It's because we're so collaborative. I mean, we believe in
Exactly.
that collaborative and equality.
Exactly.
So you do want everybody to move up together or want to nurture other people. Isn't that part of it?
Yes, and I think that's absolutely great.
Yeah.
And what we need to learn how to do better is to form those coalitions better so that we can all move forward together.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
You're very optimistic.
I am. I'm the
And
eternal
Courtney,
optimist.
what does it mean to you?
I think we sort of agree on what it means writ large, but I think one of the things that's particularly important to my generation is this idea of intersectional feminism, so that feminism is about that cross-section of race and class and gender. And of course, that's not a new idea, right? This is an idea that stretches from a while back, but I think my generation has seized on that in a probably more hearty way than generations past. And so I think sometimes part of what Gloria is speaking to is there's some frustration around that because it's so diffuse and it's so fragmented, because it's not about women. It's about, for us, gender, race, police brutality is a feminist issue. You can sort of put everything in that bucket, and that makes it very hard to sort of work together.
Well, this is the surprise. I'm the oldest one on the panel, and I agree with the youngest person, but you're all agreeing the same. I mean, I've always believed in activism and being, but I think maybe that's because I was a politician and an office holder, that you broaden your interests. I mean, you're always I always wondered what they meant with women's issues, because I felt all issues are women's issues. So that's an interesting
a good question.
thing.
I mean, I think that's a point that sometimes comes up when we speak, is if feminism is everything, is it anything?
Yeah, right.
But all issues may be women's issues.
Isn't it not humanistic or something that we're all equal? People should be treated with dignity and justice.
Absolutely. But to get there, I think it's also important not just that there be women's issues. That's really not the question. The question is, do we look at the issues with women in mind? Do we look at issues with a gender lens? And you often see situations where, look, for example, do you know how many women are on postage stamps as compared to men? It's like 25% women, 75% men. Do you know how, with statuary, what the percentage is? It's less than 10% women. So, you know, when you start to look at the world with a gender lens and you begin to try to bring equality to the representation of women and to women's participation in politics and work and in equality in the home, that's a gender lens.
See, I've always thought, and it's similar but it's different, I've always thought there's a women's perspective to public policy. That we think a little differently maybe, and that may change with the generations, because I think the younger men are different from older men. But it's the way you look at things and the way you handle things that's really our uniqueness, and that's my spiel. I don't know. I've never been, I mean, of course we don't like the fact that there aren't equal number of men and women in the Senate or in legislative bodies, or that women are still not, I don't know, you don't get your clothes tailored free and all of those kinds of things. But I'm not sure, and I guess around that you could get all the women unified. But could you get all the women unified over public issues like welfare? Now, what do you think?
Well, I think you could definitely get women unified over having cleaners charge less for
Right,
our,
right.
It really pisses me off. But I think that there have been a lot of examples lately of women rallying around causes, and those need to be amplified. I know Courtney, who blogs at feministing.com, which is a big mouthpiece for younger women, covers a lot, a range of issues that and reports on the ground activism where women have actually made changes. I mean, I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly like if you watch the healthcare debate this time around, there was a huge amount of, and largely part due to Gloria and the work of the Women's Media Center, sort of rallying people together to say we really need to fight this and assert ourselves at this very opportune moment when a lot of attention is being paid to these issues of abortion rights and healthcare rights, et cetera. But I think part of what we struggle with, and Gloria and I kind of are always grappling with this, is the idea of intersectional feminism and sort of having all of these issues come under the umbrella in theory is what I know to be right in my heart. But when it comes to actual change in the world, I get that that is not the most effective way to approach political or social change. That in that process of like holding all of that stuff together, I'm not strategic about sort of where do I use my energy, who do I build coalitions with, how do we get people in office. And so I think that's some of the frustration that we find between generations, is sort of a lack of pragmatism, maybe.
But I think that's true, but I think also it's a combination. I mean, I'm thinking of the civil rights movement and the sit-ins at the lunch counters. That was an abrupt, I mean, that's equivalent to the women organizing to do something, a civil disobedience or something with abortion. But then also you have a broader agenda, maybe. It involved more than just pointing out that one thing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, that's always been my big mantra, is don't wait for it to come to you. Be proactive. Be a thermostat and set the temperature, not a thermometer, and measure it. And I really think that the women's movement has not always followed that path. And well, I mean, you could even go back, for example, to the suffragists. After the suffrage amendment was passed and was part of the Constitution, Alice Paul, who wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, said immediately, we need to keep going forward. We need to have a progressive agenda. And she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment at that time. And it's been submitted in Congress every year since then, even though it has not passed yet. But most of the women's movement, most of those who had been involved in suffrage, said no, done.
Well, I think that's a question of strategy. I think there are always people who have to be at the extreme and pulling everybody else along and not getting impatient with doing it. I think that may be part of it. You know, there are different roles different people play.
There are also such different methods these days.
Yeah.
So, for example, at Feministing with the internet, we can sort of mobilize people in a way that we could never mobilize people before. So a great example is one of our readers saw a pair of underwear, like tween underwear in a Walmart that said, "Who needs credit cards?" written on them, which is obviously totally disgusting. Took a picture with her camera phone, sent it to us. We posted it. The next day, Fox News did a story on it, and then Walmart pulled the underwear the day after that. So that's the kind of thing that organizing would have taken a lot of energy and time. The problem is that is not part of an agenda. I mean, Feministing has the agenda of empowering young women, making them know feminism is theirs for the taking and for the using, you know, all that stuff. But we don't have sort of a political agenda. So that's a wonderful success, but it doesn't fit into a larger vision.
Yeah, that's the point, Courtney, is that we are great, and I think in general human beings, not just women, human beings in general are great at reacting.
Right.
We are not so well wired to be proactive, to look at what's our vision, what do we want to make happen in this world.
Right.
And that's what I'd like to see women do more of, is to get together and say, you know, we want 50-50 in Congress, and we're going to get this by 2020, and this is how we're going to go about doing it.
Right.
And we're
That's
only
the kind
still
of
at
thing.
18%
Right,
of women
yeah.
in Congress,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But I think what Courtney raises too gets at an intergenerational rift, because sometimes I think older feminists look down upon, oh, the internet active, you know, or just there's a bunch of blogging going on by younger women, but that's not really activism, that's not feminism, you know, and I think that there's a struggle over definition of what is activism today, and I think the truth is it doesn't look like it always did, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Well, it's interesting because even I worked at Ms. Magazine, and even though I worked at Ms. Magazine, I'm not a rigid feminist. I don't know how to say it, but
What is a rigid
what does that
feminist?
mean, and why not? Like, you know,
I'm thinking of some of
feminist
my
and
older
proud
friends and some of the leaders who've really accomplished great change. But I always, looking back to the Obama-Clinton election, I think some of them were very rigid in their understanding of what that election meant to people. And that, in a way, I think colored people's thoughts about what older feminists are. You know? Maybe, I may be totally wrong, but there's a doctrinaire sense about older feminists that is due, I think, mostly to the survival of the doctrinaire older feminists, or that they haven't heard from milder people who are feminists, you know, but aren't going to be the activists. The activists of long ago are still representing that generation as activists. I may be all wrong, and all my friends are going to kill me, but
no, it's interesting. I think, you know, it's also interesting too to think about the images of older women activists and younger women that came out around the Hillary Barack debate. Courtney and I actually wrote an op-ed together. I was a Hillary supporter, she was an Obama supporter. And we started it, I think, you know, an older Hillary fan and a young Barack Obama supporter walked into a bar, you know, because it was the beginning of a punchline. Yeah. There were such cliched images of, you know, both sides. And I think the important thing there was to figure out ways to come together, and yes, we can, you know, agree on certain issues and you know, move agendas forward in spite of our disagreements. And I found it very personally frustrating, as I do often, when disagreements among women of different political opinions get cast as a catfight. You know, when men disagree in public, it's called conversation.
Right.
But sometimes I think we do that to ourselves, which is one of the reasons we created the panel, is we sort of had this conversation about, well, how often do we actually model respectfully disagreeing in front of people, of different women of different generations? I mean, I think women ourselves have such an aversion to conflict so often that we're afraid that if we disagree, you know, Gloria supports Hillary and I support Barack, that somehow that means I don't respect Gloria, which is of course not the case. So we actually wanted to, you know, get into a little bit on these stages in front of college students to show women of different generations need to have these conversations. We have so much wisdom to gain from one another, and if we're afraid of upsetting each other, or that if we say the wrong thing, all of a sudden our mentor will reject us, you know, we really lose out. All of us lose out.
It's true, and then I think of all the similarities. I mean, we're really all very similar, right? And also, it's very frustrating because the struggles are still the same. We're still with abortion, right? We're still with the Equal Rights Amendment or something. We
still have no work-life policy.
We have no work-life policy, right? We haven't even agreed on it's always that tension between and women, and I assume your generation has the same thing, that women who stay at home feel they're frowned upon by women who go to work.
I think the mommy wars have played out in a really interesting intergenerational way. You know, with the announcement of the opt-out revolution, that wasn't, you know, let's be real, how many women can really afford in this country to opt out of careers? It takes two incomes to make a family work, and it's been that way since the 90s, mid-90s. But, you know, the opt-out revolution was pitched as younger, what happened to be, you know, my generation at that time, abandoning careers, you know, letting older feminists down and all the gains that they fought for, all the doors that they knocked down, all the ceilings they tried to crack, and, you know, here we are just kind of neatly marching home and saying, thanks, we're done, we'll just, you know, go home now. And I think, A, that wasn't happening, and B, you know, of course that's going to create a rift and a sense of betrayal. And I think really what's happening instead is women who become mothers are often blaming ourselves when we can't find ways to make it all work. And the mommy wars is a good diversion from having us all come together and, you know, really rally for true flexible workplaces that allow families to exist.
And childcare, quality childcare, and quality everything else. These are issues that we're still talking about.
Very much so. And don't you think, Deborah, don't you think that the recession itself has turned out to be the chaos that has been the opportunity for us to get off of that mommy wars thing, because the economic realities are that two-income families are the norm now. Just this year, women became 50% of the workplace. And the feminist movement has changed men as much as it has changed women, so that the men too want to have more work-life balance. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for men and women to join together and finally change some of those workplace policies, because, you know, I know my son, for example, really would have liked to have taken paternity leave when his children were born, but he was afraid to.
Yeah.
He was really afraid to do that.
That speaks to one of the missing pieces of this conversation, which is the personal is the political, right, which we're still talking about, and that idea that, you know, I'm 30 years old, I'd like to have a child someday in the near future, and I don't have a model necessarily of a woman who says, I really like the balance that I found. And part of that is the legislation, for sure, is the workplace culture, but part of it is women's relationship to our own ideas about what success is. You know, I wrote a book called Perfect Girls, Starving Daughters, and in it I said this generation was told we could be anything. We decided we had to be everything, and that mistranslation was because we were watching these super moms who take responsibility for absolutely everything on earth. And that gender shift, I'm not sure has changed as much as we would all like it to at times.
It is also the media and how these issues are all presented, isn't it? I mean, people who are writing these things or talking about these things always look for the crisis point, if they can find it, or the point that's going to make it most dramatic.
There was an interesting forum in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago called Who's the Best Mommy of Them All, talking about how a new generation of intense woman who's becoming a mother, you know, brings that intensity to her mothering and starts judging other mothers, you know, where she feels lacking in herself. But I think, you know, to go back to something that both Courtney and Gloria raised, the recession has been a great leveler in some respects, and I think we're still watching the fallout. You know, more stay-at-home moms are now trying to re-enter the workforce because of necessity. More men were laid off, though women were obviously very equally affected by the downturn. And the men coming home and being stay-at-home fathers, that actually happened in my household. My husband got laid off in January. I became pregnant with twins in February. And I went back to work in December after I had them, you know, 2 months after I had them. And he is home sharing the childcare. And, you know, I bring up this example because I think I am one of multitudes, and it, you know, the fallout and how we're seeing the gender shakeout of the Great Recession play out is still an unwritten story.
I think there's also a hidden segment in there of the older women who were employed, who are increasingly finding that they're out in this recession off of payroll, and the impossibility of them finding another job. And it's I think, increasingly getting to be a big problem. But I don't know who's out there to defend them.
I don't know either, but to get back to a point that you raised earlier about women seeing some of these issues differently just because we're women, actually the data does indicate that that's true. That doesn't mean that everybody in a policy-making position sees it differently, but statistically, just the data shows that generally speaking, women who are in elected office tend to pay more attention to the issues like workplace fairness, paycheck fairness, childcare, healthcare, and issues of that nature. So it really does make a difference, and that's why I think there needs to be a strategic agenda. And the strategic agenda is not just to say we need to have this happen. It's also to speak to women ourselves, because there are the external barriers that we've always dealt with, and many of them are still there. But there are also the internal barriers that we are still struggling with. And that's, I think, what is keeping us from walking through the doors.
If only we could be free to be mediocre, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's such a great saying.
Case in point, there was a study that just came out last week that found even as more fathers are pitching in and doing more than just pitching in at home, women are still not loosening the reins, and they're feeling like they're questioning their competence as mothers when their husbands are kicking in more, which is such an example of how we internalize, you know. So I think it's both personal and political, very much so.
But I'm still stuck on this agenda question of how would we ever agree? Because I find even at feministing.com, you know, we have a group of, 7 editors, and we can't agree on things. So how would, as a whole feminist intergenerational, intercultural, interclass movement, how would we actually agree?
Well, I think the first thing would be to give ourselves a break and know we don't have to all agree on everything.
Okay,
but
let
us find something.
Right.
Let us find something.
Let us find
one thing or 3 things or 5 things that that a significant portion of us can rally around.
Right.
And then that makes everybody stronger.
But don't we have to do something a little differently? Because let's take the abortion issue. There was a time when the question of choice was not as received as violently as it is now. So what did we do that was wrong? Isn't it that there's a whole another movement in the country that is different from what we are as far as progressives or, interested in everything? And what are we going to do about it, Sarah Palin? I mean, what are we going to do about this kind of thing?
Well, my answer is that the whole issue of reproductive rights needs to be rethought as a human rights issue.
Oh, absolutely.
The right to privacy it's a good thing, and we don't want to see that overturned. But it was never strong enough, and we really need to rethink and rebuild an entire legal basis and an entire social and political structure around the values of women actually being human beings.
My generation's also doing a cool thing, and it's intergenerational, but I feel like it's really pushed by a lot of very young women who are interested in this work around reproductive justice. So making sure that the frame is broad enough that we're talking about how you get to have your babies and economic rights when it comes to birth control and access to sex education, and sort of really like broadening that frame so that perhaps we can have more sort of strategic influence among people who get really caught up on the abortion issue as the only one that they can sort of see and fight about.
It's my father, I've told you, worked for Planned Parenthood in the 40s. And it just continues. So I guess as you get older, you have a different perspective of the length of time it gets to do these things. But it's just not only the freedom of choice, it's the equality. And I always years ago when Anita Bryan was doing this referendum in Florida, I always felt that gay rights was kind of similar to choice, the ability of anybody to do whatever they want to, as long as they're not hurting anybody. I mean, what more is there to discuss?
Right, and I think that
But now we've come into a different definition of who you're hurting when people talk about an abortion. Because they've changed their minds about, they call a fetus a baby. Well, we know that. We heard that on the Senate floor.
There's a lot we can learn, actually, from the gay rights movement.
Yeah.
I think that the women's movement needs to study the gay
You'd
rights
like to be
movement.
ACT UP.
And yes, exactly.
That was a great organization.
We need to assert that we are human beings and just get over it,
Yeah.
I actually think that the virulence of the reaction to women's reproductive freedoms and justice is a symbol of the fact that we actually have made such progress. And we are changing the world. In our view, we're changing the world for the better. In their view, we are shaking things up. We are shaking up the old hierarchical patterns. And so that's just a phase we have to go through. I am the optimist.
So what do your younger feminists think about the older feminists?
I couldn't generalize that largely. I mean, I think there's a sense among a lot of young women that we're not necessarily heard and sometimes mischaracterized by older feminists, but I also think a lot of us in individual cases... And when
you talk about older feminists, who are you talking about?
I'm talking about, particularly around the election, for example, the notion that if you wanted to support Obama, it just meant you were afraid of power and, you wanted your boyfriend to like your vote or whatever, as opposed to no, young women really thought this through and they feel like their allegiance is with Obama, as much as they want Clinton to get a fair shake.
But there were a lot of feminists that were supporting Obama.
There were, but that was certainly an intergenerational issue where my generation got mischaracterized, in my opinion. But I think individually, what we need to keep highlighting is that there really are a lot of intergenerational relationships that are incredibly life-giving and exciting and joyful, and where this sort of exchange of wisdom is happening. And the media likes to pitch us all as fighting all the time, but in fact, individually, there's all kinds of awesome mentoring going on.
Right.
I think a lot of it, you could say it all comes down to mother-daughter relationships, right? And we kind of tend to stay away from that because I think, what we do on the road and what we try to do here is to really model kind of insightful difference of opinion without some of the, emotional baggage that, often comes with the mother-daughter thing.
I'm incredibly grateful, actually, for what I've had the chance to learn. From having these conversations, not just the ones in public, but also the ones that we've had as a group in private.
Well, you're very lucky, and I've enjoyed this conversation, and we're at the end of our program. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having us,
Ronnie. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And I wish you luck with all your books. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.